my two friends, Tim and Patrick, decided to go camping together. We had this tent, a snug little thing, just big enough for the three of us. When we first arrived, there were a couple of other campers scattered around the area. It felt nice, knowing we weren't completely alone. But by around 4:30 p.m., the sky started to darken, heavy clouds rolling in like a thick, gray blanket. The wind picked up, sending a chill down my spine, and I could see flashes of lightning in the distance. I watched as the other campers began to pack up, hurrying to leave before the storm hit. In a matter of minutes, we were the only ones left. Tim and Patrick decided to go gather some wood, eager to start a fire and cook our dinner before the rain came. "We'll be right back," Tim called over his shoulder. I nodded, watching them disappear into the thick woods, their figures swallowed by the shadows of the trees. I busied myself, unpacking the food and other things we'd need for cooking. The wind continued to howl around me, making the trees sway and creak. As I was laying out the supplies, I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. I turned to see a car pulling up. For a second, I felt a wave of relief. More campers, I thought. We wouldn't be alone after all. But that relief quickly faded. The car door opened, and a man stepped out. He looked middle-aged, his hair graying at the temples, but there was something off about him. He was alone. No gear, no tent, nothing that suggested he was here to camp. Just him. He lit a cigarette, and I saw his eyes flick toward me. He took a long drag, exhaling a plume of smoke that was quickly snatched away by the wind. He was staring right at me. My stomach tightened. My friends still weren't back. I could feel my heartbeat quicken, every sense on high alert. What if this guy wasn't just looking around? What if he had something else in mind? Something bad. I watched him closely, trying to keep my face calm. He took a final drag from his cigarette, then flicked it away, the glowing ember dying in the dirt. And then he started walking toward me. I felt a rush of panic, but forced myself to stay still. I discreetly slid my phone under the food container, just in case. The man's footsteps crunched louder as he got closer. My mouth felt dry. I could see every detail now. The deep lines on his face, the dullness in his eyes. "Hey," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You got a glass of water?" I forced a smile, trying to appear friendly, but my hands were trembling. "Yeah, sure," I said, reaching for a bottle and pouring some water into a plastic cup. I handed it to him, my eyes darting to the path my friends had taken. Still no sign of them. The man took the cup, his eyes never leaving mine. He drank slowly, almost deliberately, as if he was savoring each sip. The way he looked at me, it wasn't right. It wasn't normal. It was like he was assessing me, deciding something. He finished the water and handed the cup back to me. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice oddly soft, almost kind. But his eyes were cold. "No problem," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just waiting for my friends to come back. They should be back any minute now." He nodded, but he didn't move. Just stood there, staring at me. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, feel the sweat on my palms. Then he spoke again, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You know, you shouldn't be out here all alone. Not safe." I felt a chill run through me, colder than the wind. I forced a smile, trying to keep my composure. "I'm not alone," I said, glancing again toward the woods. "Like I said, my friends." He cut me off. "Your friends," he repeated, almost mockingly. "You mean the two who went that way?" He pointed into the woods where Tim and Patrick had gone. My stomach dropped. How did he know that? I didn't respond, just stared at him, my mind racing. He took a step closer, his smile widening, showing too many teeth. Yeah, he said almost casually. I saw them go in there. Funny, though, haven't seen them come out. I took a step back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground. They'll be back, I said, more to myself than to him. He chuckled, a low, sinister sound that made my skin crawl. Maybe, he said, taking another step closer. Or maybe they won't. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What do you mean? He just smiled wider, his eyes glinting with something dark. I mean, he said, leaning in close enough that I could smell the stale cigarette smoke on his breath. Sometimes people go missing in these woods. I felt my blood run cold. I had to get away. I turned, my eyes frantically searching for an escape route. But before I could move, I felt his hand clamp down on my wrist, his grip like a vice. Hey, I shouted, trying to pull away, but his grip tightened. His smile was gone now, replaced with a look of cold, cruel amusement. You're not going anywhere, he said, his voice low and menacing. Not until I say so. Panic surged through me. I thrashed, trying to break free, but he was strong, too strong. I opened my mouth to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. My mind raced. What should I do? And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. My heart leaped. It was Tim and Patrick emerging from the woods, their arms loaded with firewood. They looked up, and I saw Tim's eyes widen as he spotted us. Hey, Tim shouted, dropping his bundle. What's going on? The man's grip on my wrist loosened slightly, his attention shifting to my friends. I took the chance and yanked my arm free, stumbling back a few steps. Patrick stepped forward, his face tense. Is everything all right? He asked, his eyes flicking between me and the man. For a moment, the man stood there, his smile gone, his eyes darting between the three of us. I could see the wheels turning in his head, calculating, deciding, and then, just like that, he seemed to relax. He let out a chuckle, a forced, unsettling sound. Sorry, he muttered, raising his hands as if to show he meant no harm. Didn't mean to scare you. Just wanted some company. He took a step back, his eyes still on us. Guess I'll be on my way, he said, turning and walking back toward his car. I watched, still trembling, as he got in and started the engine. He didn't look back as he pulled away, the tires crunching over the gravel. Tim and Patrick rushed over to me. What the hell was that about? Tim asked, his face full of concern. I don't know. I stammered, still shaken. He came out of nowhere. Patrick looked down the road where the car had disappeared. We should get out of here, he said, his voice steady but tense. This place gives me the creeps. I nodded, still catching my breath. The three of us quickly gathered our things, packing up in record time. As we hurried back to our car, I couldn't shake the feeling of the man's cold, calculating eyes on me, even though he was gone. As we drove away, the first raindrops began to fall, tapping softly against the windshield. I looked back once more, half expecting to see his car following us. But there was nothing, just the dark, empty road behind us. We didn't talk much on the drive back. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were all thinking the same thing. We were lucky that Tim and Patrick had come back when they did. As we pulled onto the main road, I finally exhaled, feeling the tension leave my body. But the uneasy feeling remained, lurking in the back of my mind. I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be going camping again anytime soon. James and Heather had been going camping together every year since they first met. It had become their little tradition, A weekend getaway to a remote spot deep in the woods, away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. This year was no different. They packed up their gear, loaded the car, and drove out to their favorite camping site. It was a secluded place, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. They were the only ones there, but they didn't mind. They'd always felt safe in their little corner of the wilderness. As soon as they arrived, they got to work setting up their tent. Heather held the fabric while James drove the stakes into the ground, both of them working in sync as they had done countless times before. Once the tent was up, they made a fire. Fortunately, there were plenty of dry branches and twigs scattered nearby, so they didn't have to wander far to gather enough wood for cooking. They sat around the fire and cooked a delicious meal: grilled sausages, roasted vegetables, and some freshly baked bread that Heather had brought from home. They laughed and chatted, enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company. After dinner, James pulled out his guitar. He strummed their favorite songs, and they sang along, their voices carrying through the trees. For a while, it felt like they were the only two people in the world, filling the quiet forest with their music. As the hours passed, the fire burned down to a soft glow, casting flickering shadows around them. James set his guitar aside, stretching his arms. "I think I'm going to lay down for a bit," he said, stifling a yawn. "All that food and fresh air is making me sleepy." Heather smiled. "Go ahead. I'll finish cleaning up." James nodded and crawled into the tent, the cool night air a stark contrast to the warmth inside. He lay down on his sleeping bag, letting out a contented sigh as he closed his eyes. Before he knew it, he was drifting off, the sound of the crackling fire and Heather's quiet humming lulling him to sleep. He wasn't sure how long he had been asleep when he felt it, a gentle hand moving over his chest. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. Heather was beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. She must have finished cleaning up and decided to join him. He smiled, his heart warming at the sight of her. They snuggled closer, her body warm against his, and he felt himself drifting off again, the comfort of her presence soothing him into a deeper sleep. An hour passed. James woke up, feeling refreshed. He carefully slipped out from under Heather's arm, trying not to wake her. He crawled out of the tent and stepped into the cool night air. The fire had dwindled down to glowing embers, casting a soft, orange glow around the campsite. He stretched, enjoying the crisp air against his skin. But then he froze. Sitting on a log by the fire, a few feet away, was Heather. She was reading a book, her face illuminated by the faint light of the fire. His heart skipped a beat. He blinked, his mind racing to catch up with what he was seeing. How could she be there? He had just left her asleep in the tent. "Heather," he called out, his voice trembling slightly. "Well, what are you doing there?" Heather looked up, surprised. "Just reading," she said, her tone casual. "Why?" James's breath caught in his throat. "But you were just in the tent." I was just with you." Heather frowned, closing her book. "No, I've been out here the whole time. You must have been dreaming." James felt a cold sweat prickling his skin. "No," he insisted, his voice more forceful than he intended. "I wasn't dreaming. You were in the tent. I felt you next to me." Heather's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "James, are you okay?" she asked, standing up and walking over to him. "Maybe you were half asleep and imagined it?" He shook his head, taking a step back. "No, it wasn't my imagination. You were there. I felt your hand on my chest. You snuggled up next to me. It was real." Heather looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. "James," she said slowly, "I promise you I've been out here the whole time. I didn't go inside the tent after you." A chill ran down James's spine. He turned to look at the tent, its flap hanging open, the interior dark and still. Then who, or what was in there with me? Heather's face paled. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe you were dreaming, she said, though her voice wavered. But James could see the fear in her eyes. She didn't believe her own words. Without another thought, James turned back to the tent. He grabbed the flashlight from his pocket and shined it inside. The light cut through the darkness, revealing the empty, sleeping bags and the stillness within. Nothing seemed out of place. But then, just as he was about to lower the flashlight, he saw it. A slight indentation on his sleeping bag, as if someone had just been lying there. His heart pounded in his chest. He stepped back, his mind racing. What had he felt? Who, or what, had been in the tent with him? Heather grabbed his arm. "Let's get out of here," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. James nodded, still staring at the tent. They quickly packed up their things, their movements hurried and frantic. As they stuffed the last of their gear into their bags, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves and making the trees creak. They didn't waste any time. They grabbed their bags and headed toward the car, their footsteps quick and heavy on the forest floor. As they reached the car, James cast one last glance back at the campsite. The tent stood there, flaps gently swaying in the breeze, a dark, empty shape against the night. He shook his head, pushing the thought away. They got in the car and drove off, leaving the campsite behind. But as they drove away, James couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them. That whatever had been in the tent wasn't finished with them yet. And in the distance, back at the camp, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying a faint, almost inaudible sound, a soft, mocking laughter that echoed through the night.